Phoebe anywhere, no matter how much I dug and bugged people and ransacked people's family pictures and all the rest of it. They're just, if there is a picture, it's gone unlabeled, so I can't, so there's really no image of her that I can show you. And in fact, the image on the front of the book is a watercolor that was done by a friend of mine, so that I had some book art that I could present. I think that's kind of an indication of Phoebe both as a person and as a historical character. To some, she was invisible because she was a woman, and because she lived in a rural area, and she didn't make a big ruckus about anything, so there wasn't any reason to notice her. The primary reason that she becomes extraordinary in her life is because she kept a diary. Now, diaries aren't necessarily uncommon in the 19th century, but diaries of women often didn't get saved. So even though young women often, especially young women of the antebellum period, diary keeping was fairly common, but a lot of those diaries just get tossed. The diaries that get kept are the diaries of men, because until recently, the history of men was the history of everyone, and the history of women was the history of no one. Okay? So that's kind of what makes her, in one area, special. But while I was working on it, so let me tell you about how I came to even find the diary. First of all, it's here in the collections of the St. Lawrence Historical Society because Mary Smallman donated it. But before she did, she made a transcript of it. And she had that transcript for a very, very long time. Apparently, sometime in the 1960s or late 60s, I think she told me, a local book, antique book dealer found it in the bottom of a box of books that he bought somewhere, and he didn't think it was of any value, and he passed it on to Mary as an object of curiosity. And I think she might have been a town historian at the time, but was a friend of his, and so he thought, well, she would find this interesting. And she did. In fact, she found it so interesting that she made this transcript. And I have the original transcript with she used carbon paper and typed it on a typewriter, and she did longhand corrections and so on. When I show my students that, they are astounded. They've never even seen carbon paper, so they don't even know what that is, right? So Mary Smallman had the transcript, and then she did a fair bit of research on Phoebe's life in Parishville, which is where she and her husband lived. And then she didn't publish anything, it just kind of fell by the wayside, and that was the end of it. Well, in, I believe it was 1999, the local North Country Public Radio was doing a piece called Sense of Place. What did it mean to live in the North Country? And because I'd written a number of pieces about North Country history, I got invited to come and be one of the talking voices on the program. And the night I was on, Mary Smallman was also on. And prior to the show, they had us, the group of us, we all had dinner together. And I ended up sitting next to Mary. Never met her before, we were chit-chatting. I was living in Ferrisburg, Vermont. And when I said that, she perked up and she said, "Oh, Ferrisburg, oh, I know where that is." And so we had this long chat about women's history and all the rest of it. And then, out of the blue, she said, "Are you going home tonight?" And I said, "No, it's 3 hours away. I'm gonna spend the night and go home tomorrow." And she said, "Well, if you have time, I'd like you to come and see me tomorrow morning." I said, "Okay." So I went. And she I don't know if any of you knew Mary. Okay, so she comes out with this file box full of stuff, and she said, "This is for you." And I said, "What is it?" And she said, "Well, I think you'll find it interesting. I'm never going to do anything with it, and I think you will." So I brought it home, and I started reading through, and the top of the box was the transcript, which was very long. And so I started reading the transcript, and I was immediately captured, because clearly this was a woman's diary from the beginning of the 19th century, a very unusual thing. And I was living right on the road where Phoebe actually lived for a while when she was a young girl. And so I was fascinated by that, and I started reaching around, I found where her father was buried in the cemetery down the road, and I gathered up all this stuff, and as I read the diary and as I began to look at various things, I got excited about the stories that began to emerge. Now the diary itself, if you look at it, it has some it's typical of diary writing in that period especially. It's got some spare phrases. Usually it starts with the weather, one word or two, and then it has a little bit about her work. And then there are these occasional bursts of emotion. And it's those occasional bursts of emotion and all these initials. It's sort of like, I remember someone else who worked with diaries a lot said, reading a diary from the 19th century, or probably from any time, is like walking into a room that's full of people that you don't know, that are all having conversations that make no sense to you. And so you have to kind of one by one figure out who these people are and what the meaning of those conversations are. And so that, I think, is a great metaphor for how you begin to make sense out of a document like that. So that's what I did. I started piecing it out and making sense out of who people were, and I started, of course, with the Vermont end of things, because that's where I lived. And I winnowed out a whole bunch of information, and then I started trying to figure out if there were any descendants left, and those sorts of things. I did a ton of genealogy and never actually connected with anybody who was a direct descendant, a few collateral descendants. There are Orvises all over Addison County, I just want to tell you that. They had huge families. In fact, Phoebe's father married twice and they basically had a total of something like 16 children who scattered across the country, really. So I began to explore Phoebe and get a sense of her life, and it became more and more interesting, and I became more and more convinced that this document had to be published, it had to be shared, because otherwise, this is no offense intended, it was just going to sit in a file in the St. Lawrence County Historical Society forever. And some people might accidentally come across it, but for it to really get exposure, publishing diaries make a big difference, because people are much more likely to pick them up and read them. And because of the nature of diaries and the way in which they are written, I decided that I would write these essays, which then kind of illuminate what's going on in the diary. I don't tell every single story. I couldn't. It would be a huge tome. But I indicate that there's lots of stories, and there are a lot more stories. And every time I pick it up and leaf through it, I find another story. So here we are, 3 years out, or almost 3 years out from when I handed over my manuscript to the publisher, and I can still write stories about the diary and some of the events that take place in it. So when I sent my proposal, not the manuscript, but my proposal out for publication, the first reaction I got was one that really took me by surprise, because I thought things had changed. And I got a very polite email from a male editor who said, "Yeah, we're not really interested in this, because after all, she's just an ordinary woman." And if you want to talk about it, here's my phone number. So I called him. And I told him in no uncertain terms that she was not an ordinary woman in a whole bunch of different ways. And even if she was an ordinary woman, she deserved attention. And when I got done with him, he said, oh, you know, we might be interested. And I said, yeah, well, you can, like, forget it. And I found another editor. But the point is that these are the kinds of things that prevent this kind of material from going out and becoming part of the narrative of history, generally speaking. And so that's a thing that's still happening. It's kind of disconcerting, but it is true. So it's another reason why I felt it was so important to publish this. So let me tell you a little bit about Phebe. Her family, her father, Lord Orvis, was one of the first settlers in a small, very small town called Starksboro in Vermont. And he and his brother were part of a small group of Quakers who made their way out of western Connecticut into Vermont and settled there. And they literally carved a farmstead out of a very raw part of, and it's a hill farm on top of that, and those farms they grow more rocks than they grow anything else, so it's really fascinating to drive up there now and to see, there's no house left, and the property itself has really grown over, but you can see just how difficult it would have been, and the rock walls just go everywhere because they were, I'm sure every time they plowed they had to keep pitching rocks to the side of the field. So Lauren and his brother came alone, but within 2 years he married a young woman who was the daughter of a family in Bristol, which is a close town, and Elizabeth Brooks. Elizabeth Brooks' father, Samuel Brooks, was kind of a man of more stature in town, and I think that made it possible for Lauren to do some things in his life that he, up to that point, hadn't necessarily been able to do. For one thing, eventually he sold the hill farm. The thing about hill farming is it produces really well for like 2 or 3 years, and then the yields start to come down because the soil is thin and it's not particularly fertile. And so unless you have, unless you're either gonna grow sheep, for instance, and have pasture, if you're gonna grow crops and rely on the soil to produce more than just grass, it's hard. And so eventually he bought a farm in Harrisburg, down in the flats area where the land is more amenable to agriculture, and became quite successful. But the years that he lived on the hill farm were the years that he and Elizabeth had their first 4 children before Phebe was the 5th. Phoebe was born in October, and her mother died in January. So she was just an infant, really, when her mother passed away. It's not really clear what, but the history of women dying as a result of childbirth is pretty, sometimes immediately, sometimes lingering and having illnesses and infections and so on, is pretty common, so it's not a big surprise. And the other thing that's not a big surprise is that Lauren couldn't keep an infant in the house. He had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl, that were at least old enough to be ambulatory and dress themselves and feed themselves, but an infant was something he couldn't cope with. And living where he did, which was pretty out there, he made the decision to hand the infant over to his wife's parents. So that's how Phoebe ended up growing up in Bristol, is because she becomes the child of their old age, the grandparents, and she fitted into their lives and became very much an important part of it. She She was an adventurous soul in the sense that she was constantly, she liked to fish. That was one of the things that I found really interesting. She would go fishing, and she was always walking. When I figured out how much she walked, I literally considered entitling the book A Woman in Motion, because it seemed like she would walk from her grandfather's farm in Bristol all the way to New Haven Mills, which was about 6 miles. And then she would walk from New Haven Mills to New Haven Center, which was another 6 or 7 miles. And then she'd walk from there home. And it just was amazing to me that she was always walking. And she also thought nothing of hitching up the wagon and taking Grandmam, what she called her grandmother, into Middlebury or to Virgins, which were those two sort of commercial hubs of the place where she grew up. She preferred to go to Middlebury because it was much more genteel. From her perspective, Middlebury was everything that she would ever want in terms of a community. It was stylish, it had the college, it had all of these stores that she shopped in. It was really a wonderful place. The interesting thing when I started really looking closely at it is Middlebury it was a very thin veneer of civilization over what was really rough boards. So it hadn't been around for that long as a community. And so her impression that it is the height of civilization is one that is her impression, but isn't necessarily true for at least a while longer. Just before Phebe visited Middlebury the first time, the Vermont legislature decided to have meetings there, and for a short time, Middlebury folks hoped that they were going to become the capital of Vermont, and it didn't happen. But they did a lot of painting and fixing to sort of attract them, and so I think that that's one of the reasons why she had this sense of this enormously civilized place, which was this tiny little town. It probably had about 1,200, give or take, residents in it. So the other part of her adventurous spirit had to do with her reading. She read widely, and she especially loved travel literature. And in the back of her diary, there's this strange page where she wrote Mandarin Chinese and translated it into vowel sounds and then what the words meant. And I looked at that for a long time trying to figure out what is going on there, and then it dawned on me. She was a Quaker, and right at the time that she was doing this in her diary, it was also a time when women Quaker missionaries were out and about, and China had just opened its doors to Western missionaries. And somehow, she never writes this in her diary. It was probably a secret that she was really holding tight, but I think she actually thought maybe she might do that. It's not what she ended up doing, but I think that's what she hoped. The other thing that she did in that vein is that she decided to go to Emma Willard's school in Middlebury. Now, I heard early on some discussion here about the normal schools and so on. Well, Emma Willard and the Willard School in Middlebury is probably one of the very first higher education institutions for girls. Their Middlebury College already existed. It didn't allow women at that point to come in its doors. And Phebe basically benefited from the fact that Emma Willard took her own desire for a formal education and turned it into this school. The interesting thing is the year that Phebe goes to Emma Willard's school, Emma Willard left and went to New York and established her school there, which is still alive and well in Troy, New York. But she left behind one of the people that she trained, and so the school lingered for at least a decade after Emma Willard went on to New York, and that's the school that Phebe went to. And I was struck when I first read the entry that she wrote about going to school. It was one of those emotional bursts. But being a college professor, I see the same thing every single fall among boys too, but girls especially. So I want to read this too, because I think it's particularly indicative of the person that she was, but also how modern she was too. Even though we're talking about someone that lived, 200 plus years ago. Monday, the 27th. She didn't even bother writing the weather. That's one of the unusual things about this entry. Attended the ladies' quarterly school, taught by Miss Lucy Burnett. Enjoyed very disagreeable feelings from various courses. First, on account of my being an entire stranger to most of the ladies, and they to me. Second, being extremely unacquainted with the manner and customs of the school. Third, I have not attended any kind of school for some years, which of course rendered me more ignorant than others of the school. And then she put in quotes, these reflections, I conclude, are the effects of injured pride. So she's very self-reflective. However, I am very pleased with Mrs. Burnett. Her dress is plain, her manner is easy and agreeable, and she excels on piety, which renders her exemplary and amiable. She goes on to say that the school opens with verses of scripture and so on and so forth. But these very anxieties, nobody's gonna like me, I don't have the right clothes, I look weird, and how am I gonna make friends? This is the same kind of anxiety that every young woman feels when they go off to school. It's so amazing to me. And so, just right from the beginning of women's higher education, these anxieties are a part of it, and they've not gone away. What does that say about us? So she goes off to the school in Middlebury, and she does an entire course, series of courses. She took all of the same, one of the things Emma Willard did was she insisted on the very same curriculum in her school that the curriculum of Middlebury College followed. She even requested the ability of witnessing the final exams, which in those days were oral recitations in front of public. People would come in and sit and listen to the oral recitations, imagine that. And she requested permission to do that. She was refused because the dons of Middlebury College thought that it would be too disconcerting to have a woman sitting in the audience. So she didn't get a chance to do that. But she actually did quiz her nephew, who went to Middlebury College, very closely about it. And she approximated almost everything that she got from him. And she read all of his books, and she basically developed her curriculum out of what she believed that was being taught at Middlebury. And she did a really good job at it. So that's the kind of work that Phebe was able to engage in. She mathematics, geography, history, the classics, Latin, all of those areas that a girl would not have been exposed to. In those days, most girls didn't really get beyond common school, which was reading, writing, arithmetic. And if you managed to get a little extra education, it was because you had a good tutor. But for the most part, this opened the doors for Phebe to, I think, dream a little bit wider. And I think that is probably the single explanation for the Chinese in the back of her, the Mandarin language in the back of her diary. So at the end of the particular session of school, several things had happened. One, Phebe had fallen in love and was totally enamored of a young man whose name was Adolphus. And she had visions of, again, very carefully, not written out in the diary in very explicit terms, but you could sort of see her friends almost always were initials or first name and initial. And he was initials for a really long time, and then all of a sudden, he's Adolphus Taylor. And you can sort of see maybe somewhere on a scrap piece of paper, Mrs. Adolphus. And she wrote about riding out with him and walking out with him and going to dances with him, and you could tell that, this romance was simmering. The problem, I think, and so this is my deduction, because there's nothing written in the diary about this, but there's a problem with Adolphus. And the problem is, he's at Middlebury, and he's going to be a teacher. And for the time, being a teacher for a man meant being an itinerant worker. You would go from school to school, and your income would not necessarily be very good. And the only outcome of actually finishing college for men was to either be a minister or a lawyer. And you could train to be a lawyer without going to college. So ministers were like the number one profession. And Adolphus wasn't headed in that direction. So teaching was his interest, and he invited Phoebe to come to his classroom and witness his teaching and all, and she was just totally, you could tell she was totally in love with this guy. Her parents, or rather her grandparents, on the other hand, no way was she going to marry a teacher. She had to marry someone who owned land. In other words, she had to marry a farmer. But they were really worried that something might happen to change that direction. And so that's how she became acquainted with St. Lawrence County. So if you're driving down 11B and you drive out of, I believe you drive out of Hopkinton, and you're Hopkinton and Parishville are kind of, well, right along that short stretch, there's a Potsdam sandstone federal style house that's rather close to, that was the Durfee Tower. And that's where Phoebe first came to St. Lawrence. Now, interesting, she doesn't really write much about how this comes about. And I think that's because nobody told her that this was what was planned for her. I think her Aunt Durfee, we're 150 miles away, right? Her Aunt Durfee shows up in February of 1821, and I'll tell you about the trip out. It's a pretty hearty trip to make in those days. And so her auntie shows up and says, you need to come back with me to the tavern. And so Phoebe has to give up school, she has to give up everything, because the most important thing in any young girl, especially unmarried young girl's life, is the family claim. They can claim you to come and take care of children, they can claim you to come and take care of elderly relatives, ill relatives, and so on. And so she, brought up as she was, couldn't refuse. And so even though in her mind, her plan was she was going to go back to school and keep going and maybe be a minister, or not a minister, I'm sorry, be a missionary. All of that, probably in her mind, all of that was put on hold. And what about her relationship with Adolphus? Well, just before she left, they exchanged love gifts. He gave her his pocket watch, which is that's a big statement. And she gave him a ring with a lock of her hair in it. So they were engaged in their minds. Maybe in the grandparents' minds that wasn't true, but they were engaged in their minds. So she's really upset. So the day that she leaves to make the trip to St. Lawrence County, this is her attitude. It's like she's going to a funeral. It's really crazy. Again, this is one of the few times she doesn't note the weather. Took leave of my home that has sheltered me 19 years to see a new country. Left them in tears. As we rode slowly in a wagon in the winter season, everyone at their window of my acquaintance, it appears as if I were following some friend to the tomb. And then she goes on to say that her Uncle John, who's kind of like a brother to her, goes as far as Otter Creek with them, and then they join up with a group of other people who are headed across the lake. Of course, the lake is frozen then, and they make their way across the lake, although she does talk about the fact that there were cracks and the horses broke through in a couple places, so it wasn't like, skipping across the lake. It was a pretty serious crossing. And they get to the other side, and everyone's exhausted, and they put up at Drew's Inn, which is near Essex, New York. First public house I've ever been in. And she also notes that they rode 15 miles on the ice. So this is the first day. The second day, she writes, little snow. Concluded to try bare ground rather than risk the lake. So that meant what they decided was instead of continuing up the west coast of the lake, they would go over Willsboro Mountain and that way. Okay. The other really weird coincidence is I lived along that road too, and I knew exactly the places that she kept talking about, so it's like, well, this was supposed to happen, right? Started with Mrs. Durfee on foot. I walked as far as Sheldon Inn, 4.5 miles. Then rode the half mile to J. Jones Inn in Willsboro Village. Walked to the top of Willsboro Mountain, 2 miles more. Tolerable sleighing down the other side. Called, took dinner at Buckminster's in Chesterfield. Past Ceylon's Forsyths and Bosworth's. These are all public houses along the way. Called at Hayes. Lost a horseshoe after passing the gate. Called at Buckminster's to get a new one. Charlotte and I walked 4 miles further to Stephen Stackpole's in Peru, and passed Cochrane's Inn, put up at Stoddard's. Walked full 12 miles, the most blessed and beautiful country I ever saw. Passed 5 or 6 ponds. Our feet were blistered. So lame, we could hardly get to our bed. And then there was such a noise, we slept little. The noise I would imagine would be the snoring man. Because everyone's sort of, higgly-piggly and so on. The 8th, colder, found some snow, rode 10 miles to Banker's Plattsburgh, so Baker's Corners, there was a tavern there. Took breakfast, passed Daniel Towson's Inn, called at Robinson's Inn, and Robinson's is now a stone ruin that's along the military turnpike extension. There's a little historic, so she called it Robinson's, 10 miles from Banker's Corners. Peru is the handsomest place I ever saw, but here in Chateauguay the road is straight and handsome. I passed 3 encampments. Many chimneys are still remaining. So remember, this is in the aftermath of the War of 1812, and so there's still, and plus there's Indian worries and all sorts of things going on. Called at Bears, put up at Robertson Moors, slept with a girl from Montreal and Miss Submit Rockville of Malone, very tired. The next day, took breakfast at Mr. John Farnell's, and was introduced to Mr. Eastman of Hopkinton. Now, she was not aware of it, but everyone else had already decided she was going to marry Samuel Eastman Jr. And if she didn't choose Samuel, then there was his brother Lee. So, of the Eastman brothers, there was going to be somebody for her. And the aunt and uncle were determined that that was going to happen. The rest of her trip so he traveled a day to be introduced to her to then travel back. So he was interested. I can't imagine that there were a lot of marriageable women here at that time. And so this would have probably been talked up to him as, here's a nice young woman who's coming out here, good marriageable material, all ready to go, probably has a decent dowry, and she did. And so he was not averse to this whole idea. And then finally they go and she takes up attendance at her aunt and uncle's tavern, where she helps to serve meals and so on. But what she really wants to do is teach. That's what she had been going to the school for. And eventually her uncle gets her a teaching position at a small schoolhouse somewhere close to the Durfee Tavern. So she teaches at least one session. As you probably know, there were sessions through the year. Boys tended to go to the winter sessions, girls tended to go to the summer sessions, and there's kind of a flip between the two, and sometimes both girls and boys are together. But it had to do with the rhythms of farm work, right? Okay, so she did get to teach. But she also worked in the tavern, and it's interesting because along with the regular sort of people passing through and traveling and looking for land, because lots of people are coming and looking for places to settle and so on. She becomes aware of the fact that her labor is a little bit too much, and so one of the things she wrote in her diary right at the time of the 4th of July was, today I've been a slave for nothing. Now in 1822, I believe it's 1822, to say today I'm a slave for nothing is a loaded phrase, right? And so it's clear that, again, she's aware that something is being done. The other thing that happens in August of that year is suddenly Adolphus shows up. And he gets a job teaching in a school in Madrid. So he's not far away. And they begin to go out together again, walk together, ride together, and so on. But Phoebe refers in her diary a number of times to these very uncomfortable conversations that she has with her Aunt Durfee. She never says what they're about, but I'm willing to bet that what they're about is Adolphus is not for you. Samuel is for you. You need to forget about Adolphus. And of course, she's in love with Adolphus, so she's not going to forget about him. But I think at some point, they took Adolphus aside and said, she's not for you, and you need to go. And so they have this tearful parting. They give each other their gifts back. And he leaves and goes back to Vermont. And promptly marries her best friend. So that, I think, was that was terrible. But once Adolphus is married, it's okay to let her come back to Vermont because there's no danger of her being married. So they let her travel back, and she makes that epic 4-day trek across the ice and the snow and so on. They always travel in February. And I wondered about that for the longest time, and I realized, of course, because if the lake's not frozen, you gotta pay somebody to ferry everything across on the ice. You can simply walk or drive a sleigh or whatever. And I did a little study of that, and before the 1970s, the Broad Lake basically froze every single year. So you could count on it. There were businesses built on moving cargo back and forth across in the wintertime. And so that was why they were traveling in February. So back to Vermont she goes, but she doesn't get to go back to school. Instead, she's sort of taken up with the fact that she's back at her grandparents' house, and her Uncle John has gotten married, and his wife is pregnant, and so there's all this extra stuff having to happen around the household. And then, in November of that year, Samuel shows up. And I don't know exactly, you can't tell by what she writes in her diary, but she writes that eventually that he's there, and she sees him. And he, one thing I should back up and say is, like, practically the second time he talked to her, he proposed marriage, and she thought he was crazy. And so I think he realized that he couldn't move that fast with her, and so he wooed her. He wrote letters to her. He did everything he could do to try and woo her. And eventually it was successful, but I don't think that it was necessarily a marriage that was a love marriage in the same way that she imagined her and Adolphus reading books together and being, that kind of a couple, right? And instead, I think she resigned herself to the fact that she was going to have to live the life that her parents and her grandparents expected her to live. That doesn't mean that she didn't come to care for her husband. She does refer to him as her special companion, her sweet companion. So there is evidence that, although she always refers to him as Mr. Eastman, she never says writes Samuel in her diary. But that's the conventions of the day. You can't really tell a lot from that. So I was reading along the diary. The first time I read it, I was completely taken aback when in February of 1823, she writes, February 5th, "Pleasant, that's the weather. What a dreadful day is this. Miss Sally Prime waited upon me today and this evening, and Mr. Henry Byington," these are her friends, "waited on Mr. Eastman to the marriage ceremony performed by Esquire Pear. He presented me with $1. I think that's a custom. Farewell to a sweet single life. I can no more enjoy you. Packed my goods, ready to depart. What a change to relinquish parents and friends, all for one of the other sex. Surprising and unpleasant." I'm not sure what was surprising and what was unpleasant, but the point is, this was really not what she wanted. And when you read the diary before this, she'll say, "Oh, so-and-so is getting married there but for the grace of God." And so that's like not really what she wants, but she gets married, and then they put all their go-to-housekeeping goods together, and Samuel brings her back to his log cabin that was out along the road between Parisville and Hopkinton. And so she's determined she's going to do right by him. She's a very pious woman. She reads the Bible every Sunday. She is very, there's never a Quaker community here for her to actually join. So a lot of what she does on her own. And she has this hope that Samuel will join her, but he never does. In fact, she comes to really dislike his brother Lee, because Lee and Samuel would drink in the tavern on the days the militia trained. And militia training was a real joke at the time. They got so drunk that they shot the cannon off, and the cannonball went into the side of somebody's guard. And what they really did most of the time, and you can read about this in the diary, is they were constantly making their uniforms. And so she was constantly like sewing epaulets and braid and stuff onto their uniforms so that they could dress up. Not to say that they weren't serious about being militiamen, but it seemed like it was more of a posturing thing than a real commitment to military activity. And there was lots of drinking associated with it. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing that happened a lot was he was a farmer. He worked all the time. But Sundays, or the days he'd go hunting or fishing or whatever it is, and she thought that was totally wrong to do. And one of the epic battles that they had was one Sunday when he came home with a bucket of fish, and she refused to cook them because they were the fruit of ill-gotten activity on Sunday. And so the fish spoiled, and that was kind of an epic moment for them. At the end of her first year of her marriage, she begins to take stock of where she is. And so it's March 12th, it's February 12th, and she writes, "Cold, frozen hard, the snow has fled, the chipping squirrel makes his appearance, washed a large wash of linen. 1 year this day since we took possession of our cottage. And what have I done? Nothing for my maker, and only little for my partner. Spun only 73 runs or 70 yards, had wove 1 coverlet, knit 3 pair of socks. I hope for better this year." Well, I happen to know that she also did something like 10 dozen candles and rendered a whole bunch of fat and took care of a whole bunch of other things on a regular basis, including feeding 20, the farmers would all get together and do their field work together. And so when they were and Samuel was, he was maybe used as dowry money, I'm not sure how, but he ended up with a pair of oxen. And so his oxen became the tractor of the local community. And so they would do his fields, and then they'd go over and do somebody else's fields and somebody else's fields. And so they would have this whole group of men sleeping in the barn or on the floor that she would have to feed breakfast and dinner and supper too. And so she worked a lot and worked really hard. She had her first pregnancy ended with a miscarriage, but she very quickly started to produce the family that everyone probably imagined they were going to produce. She was incredibly, despite that first miscarriage, she was incredibly lucky in terms of that. I'll say more about that, but I want to read you. This is the birth of her first child. Friday, May 7th, 1824, rainy. Oh my God, what a day this is, and how hast thou supported me through it. At 8:30 didst thou make me the mother of a lovely son, weighing 7 pounds 4 ounces. Thanks to my God, it will never be a mother. Since it has been thy will to restore me to my bosom friend, see her husband's her bosom friend, with this little pledge of love, instead of taking me from him, wilt thou grant us the wisdom to bring it up in thy fear, and teach him to remember his Creator in the days of his youth, greatly distressed through the night. Covey for a nurse. Covey was a neighbor. So there's a lot buried in this, right? Okay, so first of all, it's a boy. Yay! For a whole bunch of reasons, right? Secondly, the struggle that's happening between her and her husband over religion has become epic. And it starts with the establishment of the Baptist Church, and the church attracts a minister, an awakener minister. So if you've ever heard of the Burned Over District and this Second Great Awakening, this is the beginning of the Second Great Awakening. And awakener ministers are going out and they're preaching in various Protestant churches, and they're fiery and they attract membership and they get everyone all excited. And so Samuel got ill, and the doctor came to the house and said, "Get your affairs in order, a lot of people are dying from this." It was some kind of respiratory disease. It shocked both of them. And so Samuel and Phoebe prayed by his bedside and said, I'm sure this is a very old prayer, if I survive, I will go to church. And so when he got better, when he was well enough to leave the house, he went to church. And he went to the Baptist church, which was close by, and he was revived by an awakener minister. And now he wanted Phoebe to be saved. She's a Quaker. She doesn't believe in baptism. And he wants to baptize their children. She doesn't want to do that either. And so that triggers a several years long battle between the two of them. And I don't know how it ended. because the diary ends before the battle ends. What I do know that at least once in that period, he tried to baptize her by stealth.
Oh boy.
Because she would occasionally attend church with him, or the church services, but she refused baptism. So this one Sunday, they had actually decided to force her into the pond and baptize her. And her sister-in-law, Betsy, who she'd become really close with, at the last minute, her conscience wouldn't allow her to carry it through, and so she warned her, and so she avoided baptism that way. But, so that struggle over baptism is one that what kind of dominated their life for a while. She was, as I said before, she was fascinating in the kinds of things that she experienced in her life. That lovely son that was born eventually fought in the Civil War and died in Baltimore. I don't know details about it, I just know that he died in Baltimore in 1862. I wonder if he was part of this particular group that was raised locally. He could have been, I don't know. I never followed that through, but he obviously became part of that larger historical series of events. They saw black people on the road to Ontario, many of whom were either escaped slaves or aiding as escaped slaves, so she witnessed the Underground Railroad in one form or another, Second Great Awakening, a whole variety of things. In 1858, and this is one of the things that really is interesting about the arc of her life. Now, I described to you the trip that she took out the first time she came. In 1858, she went back to Ferrisburg and visited with some of her siblings and her stepmom, that Ruth Brown, who had married Warren Otis after Elizabeth Brooks died. And to get there, her husband took her to the train station. She took a train to Plattsburgh. She got on a ferry. She went across the lake. She got on another train, and she took the train to Ferrisburg. It took one day. And they knew she was coming because she sent a telegram. So that's the difference between 1820 and 1858. This enormous arc of technology and change and transportation and all of those other things. And her life gets mediated by that. She makes one trip out west to visit with relatives in Michigan, which I think is an interesting thing for her to have done. And so I can't tell you everything in the diary, but I think I've shared some of the favorite things, and I encourage you to take a look at it. But before I'm completely done, and I'm just about out of time, but we started a few minutes.
It's fine.
I want to answer any questions you might have, so I'll take a few questions if you.
How many children?
Oh, good question. 13.
Oh, wow.
12 of them lived to be adults. That is an amazing record for that period.
How long did she keep a diary for?
The diary that I found spanned between 1820 and 1830. And right at the end of the diary, and there's blank pages at the end, so she could have kept writing, but her 5th child was born. And I think at that point she was just so completely overwhelmed that she wasn't able to write again. In the back of the diary, there were some loose sheets where she made some notations, and those were her trips that she took. But she never really kept, that I can find, another diary. I do know, though, that there's an earlier diary, because when she gets to page 70 in this diary, she says, this is the second time I've covered that many pages. So somewhere there may be an earlier diary of hers, but that's, some women kept diaries their whole lives, but I suspect that with all of the work and everything that needed to happen, it was difficult.
Regarding the tavern or the inn where she lived with her aunt in
Mhm.
Parrishville,
Mhm.
is that where the marker is in Parrishville? There's a marker that says there was a tavern there. I think it's right next, I was gonna say church, maybe not. But.
I don't
you
think
know-
that's it. I think that, I took an original map and I mapped it, and that Potsdam sandstone building is right where the Durfee Tavern is located on the old map. So, and the road didn't deviate very much. Go ahead.
Is this on the north side of the road or on the south side?
North side.
North side, okay, I know
Yes.
exactly which house it is.
Is
And
that
I'm
on
pretty,
72? I'm confused.
No,
Is that
11.
no, it's on 11B.
Yeah,
Okay, it's on 11B.
Mhm.
it's got the little windows in the gables.
Yes,
Yeah, I know the house exactly.
Okay, so it's on the right-hand side as you
it's
go.
on the right-hand side as you're coming this way, and it's after you pass through Hopkinton, and there's like a short stretch of
Town of Parish.
Parrishville, and it's in that stretch. And you can't miss it, it's a huge,
It's really close to the road.
it's really close to the road, it's a huge federal style building built in Potsdam sandstone.
Yeah, I know.
And I noticed there's another building like it that's down the road and on the opposite
That's
side.
why I asked to clarify, because I
Oh,
thought it was
okay.
the one on the north side, but I wasn't sure.
Well, according to the original map,
Yeah,
their tavern is on the north side,
yeah,
not on
then
the
it has
south
to be
side.
that one.
But it looks like the same builder built both buildings because they look so similar.
And she and the family stayed in that area.
Yes, their house was located somewhere along that stretch. Mary Smallman knew where it was, but I could never quite figure it out. You'd have to really go through I think the town records to kind of ferret that out. I just know that they were there along that road from the map.
Because the Parrishville bicentennial was 1814, or not 2014, so 14, and she was, I wasn't quite clear of the years.
Oh, I'm
When does
sorry.
her diary begin?
Her diary begins 1820. So she comes to Parrishville in 1822 as a single person.
Working tavern.
To work in tavern. And then she comes back in 1824 as a married woman.
And the Baptist church, was that Hopkinton?
I believe
Or
so.
Parrishville?
I'm not positive about that. I actually found it and they're buried in the churchyard there. But
Yeah, well,
was
it sounds like you just engaged yourself so
I
much
did.
in this.
I did. There were times when I became obsessive.
And when will it be published, or what?
It is.
It is, it's a book.
It's a book.
And we can buy it.
And you can buy it.
Today.
I don't have any with me, but Amazon.com has them. And you can also get them, I don't know if anybody locally has them, maybe the books, well, I know the bookstore can order them for you.
Well, I just think that's so commendable, and it's wonderful that you came over to tell it, I mean, this is great, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Very good. Any other questions?
What was her first son's name, his first name?
Oh my gosh, I totally blanked on that. I want to say his name was Lorenzo. They have this really interesting combination of names. But I was gonna check and see if I can find a list for those. But his last name would have been Eastman, and so it's like, although Lee eventually married and had children, as did there was another brother who was already married by the time Samuel and Phoebe.
Were any other male children named Samuel? She didn't name the first one Samuel?
No, she didn't name the first one Samuel. I think she did. I should know them off the top of my head, but it's been a while since I've looked at all of the details. But her daughters, so her first son, I'm pretty sure his name was Lorenzo, and the second child was a girl, and she named her Lucinda. And then, it's Henry, Isaac for one of her brothers, and there were, most of the family names got repeated throughout her children. And
The first son is sometimes named for the grandfather. And then the second son would be named for the father.
That's the Irish, that's not.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing is, both grandfathers' names were Samuel. Samuel Brooks and Samuel Eastman, and then the father's name was Samuel. So,
You said it was the first son who was in the Civil War?
yes.
It would be in our town Civil War records upstairs, I'm sure.
Well, it's worth taking a look.
I'm curious, was her husband her age or a much older man?
I think they were far apart in age, just a couple of years, so they were, pretty close. He outlived her, I think, by 2 years. And they're, as I said, they're both buried in, I believe it's the Hopkinton Baptist Church. I just remember, I drove over there, this was so long ago now that I'm really not good on remembering this for sure, but I drove over there and just kind of drove around, found the Baptist church, and there was the churchyard, and I knew they were buried in the churchyard because I had consulted the McClellan cemetery records and that are at SUNY Plattsburgh, and there they were. So I just needed to find the cemetery in order to find them, and they're buried together with the one child that died before adulthood. And then the rest of their children are scattered here and there. Adolphus, interestingly enough, I would just say, people will say, oh, it's too bad that she didn't get to marry the man that she loved. But, and he married Harriet instead of her. But Adolphus died at age 35, probably of tuberculosis. It's very common then. And so he left Harriet with, I think, 3 or 4 children. And so it probably wouldn't have been a good match anyway. And they're over in Stockholm. There's a cemetery over in Stockholm where they're buried. So.
What's the title of your book?
An Extraordinary Ordinary Woman.
Great title.
Yep, that's the one thing I can thank that editor for.
Did you send him a copy?
I thought about it, but I thought that would be kind of cheeky. And being an editor, he probably saw it come out, so I didn't want to rub salt into the wound. And I'd like to publish other books, so I don't want editors. Yeah, the thing about editors is they move around a lot, and so you don't want to go to a press and find somebody who hates you there. Yes.
What was the first step you took to publishing it and getting it all together and
Well,
first have it in your hand?
when I first had it in my hand, well, Mary had done the first step, really, and that is a transcription. You really have to do a transcription because trying to read the handwriting and flipping back and forth, that doesn't work. But if you do a transcription, especially a digital transcription, then you can do all sorts of searches. So one of the things that happened, I published a couple of articles before the book came out. And so I got calls and emails from people all over the place saying, I think I know someone who I'm descended from, or my husband's descended from, and can you look them up? And I got an email from a young woman who was working on a master's thesis out in Ohio, and she was looking at rural farm development in the period, and she said, I'm studying a David Orvis. Could he be related? And I did a search, and sure enough, Uncle David, who lived in Cayuga County, Ohio, had written her a letter, and this is what he said. And so I could pull out the reference and ship it back to her. So that's really I would say, is the first step. And then the second step is to really, to get a sense of things, is to look at the kind of broader scope of what's happening around, because then that gives you a sense of because often there'll be these little cryptic remarks, and you think, well, what does that mean? Well, if you know that there's something going on, then it kind of can connect and make more sense. So it's detective work, in part.
Because I have my grandmother's diary from 1893.
Yes, yes, and I say, yay, do something with it, because that's the thing. I'm actually I'm working on a project right now that also makes use of the diary, although it's not a woman's diary in this case, but I just heard about a woman's diary that's connected, and I'm sort of champing at the bits, like, I want to put this down, so I can go look at that one. But diaries can become an obsession too.
Well, I read it every day.
I know what you mean. Any other questions?
I am curious, the friend who married Adolphus, did Phebe stay friends with her? Is there any
Yes,
information
actually,
that we-
I should have said that. Well, at first she was shocked, but I don't think she was ever angry. And, when Harriet and Adolphus came out, they came to visit. She and Samuel went and visited them. So I think she was glad to have her not that far. I mean, Stockholm isn't like right next door, but it was close enough that they could see each other occasionally. And visiting is the primary activity of leisure, not that these people had a whole lot of leisure. I learned so much about women's work in this diary that I thought I knew, and I wasn't even remotely aware of. Things like having to produce your own, I knew about making soap, but there was a couple of entries where she talked about going out and cutting pine boughs and boiling them, and I thought, what in the world is she doing? Well, she was making pine salt, and she was making a kind of an astringent to use, the liquid would be an astringent and for wounds and things like that. So she was constantly engaged in manufacture of something, I'm bottled, my mind is bottled on the amount of yarn that she spun, the amount of cloth that she wove, I just imagine keeping all those children in socks. And she had to constantly be knitting. And I gave a little talk about this at the Rugby Museum, which is a little historic house museum in Harrisburg. And I said, these women with lots of children had to be constantly knitting. And as I said it, I turned and looked, and there's this photograph of Roland Robinson and his wife, and in her lap is double-pointed needles with white thread on it. And I said, see, there she is. She's even getting her picture taken with her knitting on her lap, right? So these people, and it wasn't just the women, the men were working constantly too, but it's just an amazing array of kinds of things that we take for granted, don't even think about. You can just run down the road to the store to get the pine saw or to whatever it is what you want, and or even more mundane things. So and foodstuffs. One of the things I was fascinated by was how she built her garden. In other words, her uncle brought her she brought some seeds from home. Her uncle brought her over some seeds. Her auntie gave her some chickens. So she kind of created her kitchen garden, which was the primary source of vegetables for the household. And, so those kinds of things you don't even think about. She was constantly whitewashing the inside of the cabin because, in her words, the logs shed dirt. And so she, the logs just, she wanted to constantly seal them so that they stopped shedding dirt.